is Face Diaspora, a platform for conversations on Eritrea. Your host, Russom Mesfun.
Let's move on. So you're removed from your position, and then there was a respite followed by a new position. What was the new position?
Well, when I left the university, I was without a job for a few months, and then I was assigned to the bank at the governor of the central bank. Again, I had also another good fortune to sort of build something from scratch, and so upon my assignment to the bank, I started also building an independent central bank, of course, with the blessing of the then Secretary General of the provisional government. And one of my first things, as with the university, was not only to establish the symbols of the bank, but to come up with a Bank of Eritrea law, defining the mandate of the bank, and then the financial institution law, establishing the regulatory powers of the central bank over the financial sector, the commercial bank, the development bank, the housing bank, etc., etc. So what I try to do everywhere as with the universities actually, establish rule of law on the basis of which then to govern my operations. Like in the university, when I submitted the charter, what I tried to do is establish rule of law in whatever I did. That's why, in fact, I drafted the charter. When I submitted to the Secretary General of the Provisional Government at the time, I said I will follow the charter in word, in letter and spirit, but I would like you to have it promulgated through submission to the then Provisional National Assembly, of which also I was a member. But pending its promulgation, I was guided by the charter in my day-to-day activities at the university. So as in the university, in the bank also, I came up with this draft laws. The first is the Bank of Eritrea law. The second is the Financial Institutions law. And the Bank of Eritrea law establishes the mandate of the bank as an independent central bank. Independent means independence from political interference, from the President's office, from the front, or from Minister of Finance, etc. It was an independent bank. I mean, the vision. It was, of course, when I was first assigned, it was discussed. I had to discuss this because I have had enough at the time. And look, in all my years, I've never heard Isaias asking for an excuse and admitting to a mistake. But when he assigned me to the bank, he said, I'm sorry, I was misled. He was implying that Barahi misled him in firing me from the university, and he regretted that. He said that he was, of course, I don't want to go into the comments that he made about me, because I took that with a grain of salt, as you would say. And I retorted to that. All that is in my book. I don't want to go into that now. But the fact is, when I am in a particular setting with a new assignment, the first thing I do is establish rule of law, a framework for my operations, for how I manage. So in the bank, I set out this, and I told the president then, he was not the president, actually. He was, again, as I said, the secretary of the provisional government. I said, under what terms? And I defined, I argued for an autonomous central bank, or an independent central bank, I should say, in the specific case, with full autonomy in the management of foreign exchange reserves of the country, in the management of the trade finance of the country, and also in having a say in fiscal policy, that's in the size of the domestic and external debt that the government incurs, etc., etc. So I enumerated the central functions of the central bank, and I insisted on autonomy, and I was granted And it was only after I was granted this autonomy that I accepted the assignment of the central bank. And in the central bank, I set out to build, again, an independent central bank that could contribute to the development of the country.
Talking about the president, you had this eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation involving the $70 million housing project. Could you please share with us what transpired in that meeting?
The issue, actually, there were several aspects to the issue. One thing, before I was able to set up really the central bank as an autonomous, as per the draft Bank of Eritrea law, as an independent central bank, one of the concessions I thought I got from the Secretary General of the Provisional Government was that it would be an independent central bank. It would have full autonomy in the management of the country's foreign exchange reserves. It would have a significant say in the country's fiscal policy. It will have full authority in monetary policy, in determining the interest rate structure, the exchange rate structure, because it was not an open market of the currency. At the time, we used Ethiopian birr, and we're actually preparing for the NAFA, etc., etc. So the key roles of the central bank, in as much as their functioning is concerned, I was granted and guaranteed full autonomy. That's non-interference from the powers that be. And the powers that be here are basically the President's office. Part of the vision was to transform Eritrea into a services center. Financial services, transport services, communication services, etc., taking advantage of its strategic location and its hardworking people. Because of that perspective, when I assumed the post, the foreign exchange holdings of the provisional government were scattered in various correspondent banks throughout the world under the auspices of the Commercial Bank of Eritrea. So one of my first measures was to centralize these foreign exchange holdings. The central bank provided for the counterpart value of all that foreign exchange holdings to the Commercial Bank of Eritrea and took hold of the foreign exchange holdings and started centralizing the operations and started, of course, investing this money even for overnight, generating interest for the government that way. So I did this with the full blessing. I put the proposal in writing. I centralized all these operations under the aegis of the central bank, having fully paid for the counterpart funds. In other words, what it means is when the central bank took over the foreign exchange holdings of the new state had, of course, foreign exchange earnings. The counterpart funds were using the birr pending the issuance of the NAFA, and the commercial bank, which was holding all these foreign exchange reserves, got the counterpart, the value of all that in birr, because birr was the then legal tender in Eritrea in agreement with the Ethiopian government, as you know. Having centralized the operations of the foreign exchange reserves of the country as agreed and as per the mandate of the central bank, the Secretary General wanted to reverse the process because he needed the front. It's not really the front again here. I don't know. It's a very complicated situation in Eritrea. When you talk about the government in the front, you had the Red Sea Corporation, which belonged to the front. And so there was no distinction between front and government assets. In fact, let me say at this point that there was a special committee was set up to separate the assets the properties, the resources that belong to the government and to the front. At the time, they were mixed. The point here is that the Korea project, which was granted to this Kingdom company, Korean company, without even bidding process. And in the first place, I had reservations about the process. In the second place, these were front projects. They were not government projects. And the Secretary General wanted to use the state resources for the front-funded project. It would have been all right for me if there was a provision to provide for the counterpart fund in the then legal tender, which was the Ethiopian birr. But I was simply ordered to give this really indirectly to the front. And then I said no. I insisted that this money did not belong to me, did not belong to the Secretary General or to the provisional government or to the front. It belonged to the people of Eritrea, and I was, of course, administering in trust. And I said that I can only manage that in accordance with the rule of law. So it was an argument which emanated from this, and it all reduced to the point where I said, look, this is not your money, it's not the government's money, it's the money of the people of Eritrea, and I can only administer it according to the rule of law, etc. So I was seen as disobeying, and he said, so you're disobeying? I said, no, I'm not disobeying, I'm saying that I will not do this. I will not execute instructions that are wrong. Ultimately, what was at stake for me was not the money per se, but the independence of the central bank. Once I gave in on that, once I started giving in to wrong decisions, which I think at the time I thought I should resist, and I resisted. And there were many people who tried to interfere and say, why don't you grant him this wish? Why do you do that? Why do you, etc. There were all kinds of interferences from friends of both of us, higher officials, etc. But I said, look, this is the right stand, and this is where I'm making the stand. So I was defending the independence of the central bank, and I was defending also the rule of law in the sense that whether it's the Red Sea Corporation, which belonged to the front, or anybody else, if they wanted to access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country, they can only do it in accordance with the law. And if there are sufficient resources, they would be granted in exchange for the counterpart fund in birr. The idea there was not to pay the counterpart fund in birr, but to just access. And so I saw that as an abuse of state resources, and I could not be party to such abuse, because I said to myself, look, if I give in to this, tomorrow I'll be forced to give in to other things. So it was wrong. I decided to make a stand, come what may, and that's what I did. So in a nutshell, the decision was wrong on two counts. First, it impinged on the promised or guaranteed, I should say, independence of the central bank to manage foreign exchange reserves of the country in accordance with the rule of law as established by the Bank of Eritrea law, whose draft I have submitted, and pending its promulgation, I insisted to work according to it in letter and spirit. So I was within my legal prerogatives to say no. Secondly, it was wrong for the Red Sea Corporation as an outfit of the front to have access to state resources without paying for them in counterpart funds. That is, without, like, they could access, if the bank had, and the bank had, of course, millions of, at the time, Eritrea had really hundreds of millions of foreign exchange reserves worth. They were squandered afterwards, but there were enough reserves to go. The front needed, or the Red Sea Corporation needed to pay for that Ethiopian birr, to pay for its equivalent at the then prevailing exchange rate, so that the money would not be lost to the people of Eritrea. The issues is very important to keep in mind the central issue here, the independence and bank. Second, the fact that a unit controlled by the front had unlimited and unaccounted, intransparent access to resources that rightly belong to the state and the people of Eritrea.
When asked to release the funds, you said, and these are your words, "No, I would not do it." First of all, isn't that considered insubordination that could get you in trouble with the president? And secondly, what was the president's reaction and what happened to your status as a governor of the Bank of Eritrea?
Look, this thing was going on for some time. So at one point, I was in a meeting not very far from his office in the then Ministry of Finance. Look, we were crystallizing the macro policy paper, the macro policy framework for the government. There were three of us, three senior officials of the government who were really giving the last final touches. We just completed the document to our satisfaction and readied it for publication. And at that point, I got a phone call from my office, from my secretary at the time, and I was told that the president needed to see me urgently. I did not really know what the urgency was, so I said, okay, we finished it anyway, so I'm going. So I left my colleagues, and when I went there, when I entered, I saw a lot of people from the front, from the PFDJ, I should say, the economic department of the PFDJ, the Red Sea Corporation, etc. People who were actually from the foreign exchange department. These were all front people, no government official. The only government official I would say would be the general manager of the commercial bank, who was also there. So there were, I don't remember now exactly, but at least 8 or 9 people, excluding the president. I went there, said hello to everybody, but I saw that there was something brewing. I felt something was brewing. So when the conversation started, it started in a very tense way. It was not really normal. It was sort of pent up. And said, why? And said, why not? Then the exchange was also terse and very, I should say, in very brief terms, okay? And I said, why? And I told him, because when I saw that, and when that issue was raised, I saw that as a betrayal. I saw that the president was playing a double game. That sort of angered me, but I did not want to show my anger. Very collected, and I say, what? And he said, this. And I say, you know why? Because he had in his hands the documents, all the necessary documents that fully justified my refusal to let these foreign exchange reserves go for a project that I did not think was in the interest of the country, did not follow proper bidding procedures, and most of all, did not follow proper financial procedures, did not follow the proper management for the foreign exchange reserves of the country, etc., etc. If I was asked to give this money and I was given the counterpart funds for that money, then that would have been a regular transaction, because the central bank allows people, private, public, front, non-front, etc., to access foreign exchange reserves in exchange for the full payment or redemption of that in local currency or whatever currency would be acceptable. So my position was that, look, why are you playing a game? You know why I am refusing, and you know I'm not going to give in. At that point, he got very angry, and he said, you're fired then, etc. So everybody left. We did not even see when everybody left We were just the two of us. And I've never seen him as angry as at that moment. And the situation was very tense. And we exchanged a few words. And he told me to get out, and I got out. But I insisted. I reiterated to him that he was making a big mistake. I did not take it personal. It was an institutional matter for me, and I made a stand. But the details now are in my book, and you can, of course, enjoy reading them if you will. But it was a very tense moment where I could see the veins in his neck almost, building up. And we were both very angry. He did not control his anger. I did control my anger. I just obeyed and left him alone. I left the room, but I was fired that way.
Well, the question is, if you're being addressed in such an abusive manner, have you had an opportunity to share with him that you could have differences of opinion, but why the disrespect and this kind of language and throwing you out from his office of someone as important as you are? Is this the first time did you see anybody confront the president saying, I would greatly appreciate it if you would not address me like this?
No, look, before, our interactions were always civil. They were, I would say, exuded of reciprocal respect. That was the first time where I saw, or where he behaved in a very uncivil manner to me. That was my first experience. I've heard of other stories that people, so-and-so was mistreated like that, so-and-so was slapped, so-and-so, etc. I've never seen him do that myself, I must, of course, admit, okay? But that was the first instance of very uncivil and uncivilized behavior where he gave vent his anger in a matter in which he was, I was convinced, remain convinced, absolutely wrong. He went back on his word to me. It was a betrayal. For me, he was double dealing. He was telling these people in the front that they can have this money, while I told him that I had this agreement, this guarantee that I will manage the central bank autonomously, and I will do only what the rule of law at the time, as provided for by the Bank of Eritrea law, allowed me to do, and that was to administer the foreign exchange reserves in accordance with the provisions. People could access them, the private sector, the public sector, and the front if it wanted, but there were rules. They have to follow the rules of the game, and that is, if funds were available in the amount requested, those funds would be made accessible to those people who ask for them. But whoever was asking for them must be prepared also to provide for the counterpart funds in the local currency we're using, the legal tender at the time, the Ethiopian birr, or any other currency acceptable under the circumstances. But to just give this money away, and it was about, I think, 68 million initially, and never to have the possibility of getting it back or the possibility of having its value in a different way was to me unacceptable. It was an abuse of power that would lead to ultimate corruption, and that's why I decided to make a stand, and I think it was an honorable stand. I'm very proud of what I did, because look, I did not have a salary. I was not working for a salary at the time. I was living like everybody else, like most of my colleagues, most of my comrades in arms, in the old barracks in Kanyo station. We're eating in this cafeteria, all of us, etc. I had nothing. I was there to serve my country and my people. That's what I felt. I never saw myself as serving a person. I was serving my country and my people. So in the service of my country, in the service of my people, I had a higher obligation.
Moving on to the G15 situation, the president fails to convene a regular meeting of the Central Committee of the Front, that is, and the Eritrean National Assembly, although senior government officials repeatedly urged him to do so. When he refused, they initiated the collection of signatures from members of the Central Committee. That's a petition. You wrote that on that very afternoon, a key insurgent leader had come to your office at the commission to ask you and another colleague to sign the petition. Mr. Ambassador, is there something that I'm not seeing here as to why you do not think it's necessary to mention the names of leaders on either side of the petition? Those who signed, those who did not sign.
Yes, because look, there are two things I do not. First of all, let me say this is the first book, and it deals with issues that have matured, that is safe now in terms of the national security of Eritrea and the safety of my former comrades in arms to talk about. I intend to write a sequel, a second, after this, to also go deeper and in more detail about these issues, and to reveal also names and personalities if necessary, when the time comes that doing so would not endanger the safety of these former comrades in arms and former colleagues. So I think the reason is their safety. For me, there is no problem, because I'm outside Eritrea, out of reach of the repressive apparatus of the regime, but they're still within grip, either in jail or in service. So that's the reason why I do not mention personalities' names in cases which I think are too sensitive.
Okay, so moving on, would you say, Mr. Ambassador, that it's fair to criticize the petitioners for not being decisive and allowing Isaias to regain power? These are your words. When they actually showed a lot of courage, despite being undermined by people who told on them with the president and actually refused to sign the petition. So they were, wouldn't you say they were very decisive?
Look, there is a history. The history of the EPLF. And one of the problems, or one of the causes of our present predicament, is our weakness as leaders of the EPLF, the weakness of the leadership of the EPLF, okay? I can only tell you this, that my experience, and therefore their experience, demonstrates that you cannot really talk Isaias into changing his ways. We've had enough instances in our history, during the war, after the war, where Isaias, when confronted, might appear malleable, pending his gaining his upper hand. And once he does that, he goes on, okay? He goes on he goes back on whatever. So what I'm saying is, I was convinced myself, and I tried to convince my colleagues, that you cannot dialogue with Isaias on these issues. These were issues of life and death, issues of power, okay, political power. And given our understanding of his modus operandi, my position was that it was necessary to neutralize him. You cannot petition him because you could predict his reaction. I mean, we knew these are not novices. These were some of the top leaders and of the EPLF. And so my disagreement with them was not on the ultimate objective of the movement, but the tactics, the strategy and tactics. I had a serious question, not only me, but several of my colleagues. We discussed this quite not quite openly, but in confidence with people we felt confident with. And our understanding was that this was not going to deliver the change we needed. We have to follow another set of strategy and tactics. And I shared this quite openly with my former friends and comrades in arms. So it was a disagreement on tactics, not on objectives, I must emphasize here.
You wrote, Mr. Ambassador, that the president was surrounded by unscrupulous yes men, self-seeking, eager informants who pander to his whims and tell him what he likes to hear. Would you say, Mr. Ambassador, that there might have been a time that is, in the past, when you too were one of those yes men who liked to inform the president what he'd like to hear? And would you have lasted even that long if you didn't do that?
I would respond to that in the negative. If I were like that, I would still have been with the regime. If I were like that, I would not have been fired from every post I was assigned to. If I were like that, I would not have fallen in trouble. Look, there are people who've been in one position for 10, 15, 20 years. I never held a position for more than 2-3 years maximum, except when I was ambassador here for 3.5 years, etc. So no, I would say definitely no, because when I was assigned a particular position, as I told you earlier, I tried to operate within the framework of the rule of law. That's why I drafted all these things and asked for their immediate promulgation. Even pending their promulgation, I would be operating on the basis of those documents in letter and spirit, etc. No, I never really saw myself in that position. I never was in that position. Although during the war, of course, there was this real debate in terms of your specific tasks. And the discussions were quite collegial and quite civil. You argued, you could say you're wrong, this is wrong, the likely impact of this is going to be this. So we should not follow this course of action, we should do that. There were disagreements, but after a while, we would always come to some sort of agreement. One would say, yes, maybe I was wrong, you're right, we should do like this. But I never really was one of those. If I were one of them, you can look at my record after independence. I never held a position for more than 2-3 years. The record speaks for itself.
If you're being removed from one job within 2 or 3 years, as you indicated, why not resign? You had the option of resigning several times when you could have. Was there any reason why you opted to stay?
Maybe you don't know the modus operandi of the EPLF. Once you're in, you're never let out peacefully. If you resign, you end up in jail. Okay? There are people who've been suspended. They're not allowed to seek an alternative job. They're not allowed to even establish their own, to be self-employed and do something. Look, the modus operandi of the front, as epitomized by its practice for a long time, is that once you're in for life. It's a lifetime commitment. I had an option of course, leaving the country, but inside the country, you cannot survive and you cannot resign and live as a free person. And so that was a constraint. But again, I did not want to leave the country. Look, I spent my youth fighting for my country and for my people. And I did not fight in order to end up in exile when in my old age, if you will. So for me...
But you did.
Finally, yes, when the push
left.
came to shove, yes, when the push came to shove, then I of course, you have... Very often, you're forced to make a decision between the bad and the worse, as I also state it in some parts of my book. You can make a bad decision, but you can also make a worse decision. Staying for me would have been joining my other friends and my former comrades in arms and former colleagues in Eritrea. And I have other responsibilities in life other than myself, my own life. And so I had to make a choice. And sometimes a bad choice is better than a worse choice. It's not always you make a good choice. You're forced to make a choice between the bad and the worse. And in my case, I made a bad choice, but a worse choice was possible. I'm glad I didn't make it.
Mr. Ambassador, you take the president to task and hold him singularly, almost singularly responsible for the plight of the nation. Can you elaborate why the president, perhaps more than anyone else, is to blame? How about the rest of the folks that you refer as rotten apples? Who are they, and how come they did not make it to your book?
Look.
I'm looking.
Let me say this to you. When we were able to take physical control of Eritrea by military means, when we established an independent sovereign state, the outcome of the free and fair exercise or choice of the people of Eritrea, then we came up with a number of instruments to help in nation building, state construction, and sustainable development for the country, to transform the country into a free, democratic, and prosperous state. These were, first, the national charter, second, the macroeconomic policy framework, third, the constitution. So these were policy instruments whose pursuit or whose implementation would have created a different Eritrea from what we see today. But all efforts to implement these essential, to follow or to utilize, I should say, these policy instruments were thwarted by the president using his executive powers without participation of the rest of the leadership. And what you see is the gradual concentration of power, the marginalization, even the transitional National Assembly. Look, one of the anomalies we made, and we made a big mistake without realizing it, none of us actually realized it, was you have a government with basically three organs, okay? The executive, the legislative, and the judiciary branch. When in our lack of wisdom, I should say, and hindsight is 2020, we allowed the transitional president to be also chair of the transitional National Assembly. We're actually undercutting the oversight functions of the legislative branch of the government. In other words, you have a transitional president who was head of the executive branch and the legislative branch at the same time, and therefore this would allow him to interfere at will with the judiciary branch as well. So without realizing at the time, and this is a big mistake, one of our biggest mistakes, we allowed him to hold these two positions. In a normal state of affairs, the legislature or the Provisional National Assembly in the specific Eritrean setting is mandated or should have the mandate to oversee the operations, the functioning of the executive branch. But with the same person heading the executive branch and the legislative branch, it was a big mistake. We allowed the concentration of huge political power in one person. That was a mistake. That was, of course, exploited to the hilt to gradually marginalize the transitional legislative the legislature, which was the transitional National Assembly, to literally emasculate the judiciary through executive interference, and of course to also marginalize key ministers in the various ministries of within the executive branch because there was no oversight. And what I'm trying to explain is we granted willingly, even if mistakenly, huge powers to one person, which he then used to concentrate greater powers to the extent that at the end, he virtually suspended the National Assembly, the Transitional National Assembly, paralyzed the transitional judiciary, which was supposed to be independent, and also really marginalized even the executive branch. The ministries were actually deprived of their statutory mandate to exercise full authority in the functioning of their respective ministries through interference of the executive branch, in a specific case through the presidency. So what you see is the incremental marginalization of key institutions, of key figures, the accumulation of power in one center, that's the presidency, and ultimately in the concentration of power. The extent that many of the historical leaders, some of the finest historical leaders of the movement, of the liberation movement, are nowhere today. I hope they're still alive, and one day they'll be able to tell their story, and of course the injustices meted out against them, against their families, against the country, the nation as a whole, etc., etc. So I say that he is singularly responsible because through acquiescence and through appeasement on our side, and this is our weakness, our collective weakness, our collective failure, we allowed him to concentrate power in his own hands and to use or misuse this power to the extent that the outcome of it is very evident in the Eritrea of today.
But still, Mr. Ambassador, and forgive me, you say in your book that there are a handful of rotten apples in the front and in the Army High Command. These people are the people we would like to hear about. Who are they? And why is it that they are not mentioned? We hear that the president is doing this and that. Okay, we get that. Why aren't the other people who are actually enabling him named in your book? Why not mention them? Who are they?
Look, again, I believe in the rule of law, and when the time comes, you can accuse people, you can charge them, you can bring your evidence in a court of law. I don't want to be accusatory in the first place. I don't want to, of course, go overboard by saying this, that. But more importantly, consistent with my two red lines, I'm not going to go into these specifics because either by association or directly, whatever I say in terms of specific personalities would impact on the safety of people who should be left alone.
Mr. Ambassador, there are people who actually say this, that the relentless criticism of the president and only the president is disingenuous, and that it's intended to keep the PFDJ or the old EPLF in place by surgically removing the president from power. What's your answer?
Look, as I have stated in the book, the reasons for our collective failure to deliver is not the president alone. I was answering your specific question. Otherwise, one of the fundamental causes of our collective failure is the weaknesses in the EPLF leadership to begin with, in the way we have operated historically. Second, the general level of socioeconomic development of Eritrea, because Eritrean society also did not have forces that could countervail and perhaps remedy for our weaknesses by, say, insisting on the application of the original objectives of the liberation movement, of the struggle for which the people, of course, waged, paid very dearly, etc., etc. So I'm not saying it's only the president to blame. No, the whole leadership of the EPLF is to blame, including myself, and that's why I take collective responsibility. If there are cases of individual responsibility, then this individual responsibility must be accounted for when the time comes in accordance with due process, okay? I do not believe in accusing one or the other at this point in time, And as we move towards, of course, towards change, the objective is not just to surgically remove the president. The objective is to bring about the democratic transformation of Eritrea, a task which we failed to date. But having learned from our experience, we want to have a government that's based on a constitution establishing the rule of law, a government that's transparent, accountable, a government that has 3 co-equal branches, each having with the ability to check the other. That is, in more specific terms, what I mean is we want to have an independent judiciary that administers justice without interference from anybody, be it the executive or the legislative branch, okay? We want to have also a national assembly that's constituted by the free will of the people of Eritrea in through a process that is free and fair, that is universal suffrage, free and fair elections, etc., etc. And then we want to establish an executive branch that's accountable to the people, accountable, of course, to the National Assembly as well, and that's transparent also in its operations. When I mean in its decision-making process, in its policy-making process, in its decisions of issues of national concern, etc., etc. So it is not a demand to surgically incise Isaias from the PFDJ and retain the... There is no PFDJ, by the way. I think I need to underscore this fact. If you look at the PFDJ since 1994, if you look at the members of the Central Committee, a majority of them are either in jail or killed or maybe have died in natural death or are in exile. There's only a minority still in Eritrea, and some of them are not active, they've been suspended, etc., etc. So the PFDJ does not exist in reality. It's just instrumentalized without real existence. A couple of individuals operating in its name does not really make the PFDJ existent and or functional. I think this is very important to underscore. So the PFDJ, as originally constituted, no longer exists. Members of the Executive Committee, the majority are not there. Members of the Central Committee or Central Council, the majority are not there. The key leaders of the key historical leaders of the movement are not there. So it's reduced to a single person and maybe less than a handful of collaborators, and them also at one point, I would say, made accountable. So the whole idea is not to just take Isaias out and reconstitute the PFDJ. The PFDJ has become defunct. It's no longer in existence, and therefore such a characterization does not correspond with the reality that prevails in Eritrea today.
Mr. Ambassador, these are your words. I admit a profound sense of disappointment and a painful awareness of shared responsibility. There's this theme that runs in the diaspora, Mr. Ambassador, that when discussing former government officials, that with an exception or two, none of you have taken full ownership of your actions and or apologized. Do you think, Mr. Ambassador, that an apology to the Eritrean people is warranted?
I'll be very frank with you. The history of the armed struggle, as initiated by the ALF in 1961, as pursued throughout the years, and despite the unfortunate fratricidal civil war we had, we all joined the national liberation movement to serve the cause of the liberation of our people and of our country. So the history of the armed struggle of Eritrea is a heroic history of self-sacrifice, of commitment, of devotion to the cause of Eritrea and its people. The physical liberation of Eritrea from Ethiopian occupation in 1991 constituted a historic victory of the people of Eritrea. Eritrea is free. As I said earlier, Eritrea as a nation exercised its right to self-determination and is joined the international community as an equal member. I think these are tremendous achievements. It is Eritrea's freedom fighters, whether they fought as members of the ELF or the EPLF, through hard work, toil, and sacrifice, which made independence for Eritrea possible. And I think this is a commendable achievement. And nobody has to apologize for having done that, okay? I do not think apology is in place in this respect. I am personally, and many of my former comrades in arms, many of my former colleagues, many ex-fighters, be it of the EPLF or the ELF, were very proud of the history we've made up to that point. But we have failed in our second task. In other words, the business remains unfinished. The people of Eritrea have not had the chance to exercise their right to self-determination as a people. I underscored in that in the beginning. So the fact that we failed in our initial or in our original objectives does not constitute a crime and therefore merit asking for a pardon. No. It is, as I said, a collective failure. And there are reasons for that failure. The historical context of a society, of course, Eritrean society, the weaknesses, the internal weaknesses of the EPLF, particularly of the EPLF leadership, the modus operandi that evolved, the hard years of the armed struggle, etc., etc. Okay. Now we're trying to redeem that failure. But failure is not a crime in itself. And failure, if you fail, you fail. Of course, you don't. We've also failed ourselves. Look, we do not fight in order to end up where we are. Okay? So I think we need to have a perspective on this issue. And the right perspective for me is, yes, the freedom fighters made the ultimate sacrifice. Many of them did not return. Many of them were ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. And it's through this dedication, through this devotion to the cause of the liberation of the Eritrean people, through this spirit of self-sacrifice, this exemplary generations of Eritreans who put their lives on the line for the sake of their country, their people, etc. Yes, that made independence possible. Beyond independence, the collective failure is there. Maybe there will be a time for accounting, but I do not blame individuals. It's a collective failure. We all failed, and collective failure, it does not constitute a crime or something to ask a pardon for.
Mr. Ambassador, you said that the president suffers from a rejection complex verging on identity crisis because he has a Tigrayan background that occasionally surfaces when under the influence of alcohol or seized under drunken brawls. How reliable are such rumors, and how constructive is it to write about the ethnic background of the president? Do you think, Mr. Ambassador, that diminishes the opposition narrative? Should we really care about the president's ethnic background instead of judging him on his performance as a leader and president?
Here, what I stress and what I wrote must be understood in its proper perspective. The president was welcomed as the liberator, okay? I think people adored him. He was virtually welcomed as a hero of the War of National Liberation. nobody actually cared about these matters. What I'm saying there is he made an issue out of a non-issue. Don't take me wrong. I'm not saying this is an issue. I'm saying that he made an issue out of a non-issue through these manifestations which I describe, and everything in my book is well documented, reliable. There is no question about that, okay? It's based on internal knowledge. It's based on hard facts, hard evidence. There's no question about that. But you must understand it in the right sense, that the president, through these utterances, through this misbehavior, has managed to make an issue out of a non-issue about which people now wrongly talk about. So this is the context in which it should be understood. Otherwise, yes, it's in fact, first and foremost, the president's performance in bringing Eritrea to what it is, for which he stands accused. Look, one of the fundamental responsibilities of government is to provide for the basic needs of society, to provide social services, public services, okay? In Eritrea today, there is no such a thing. A government, look, the struggle in life, every human endeavor aims to improve the human condition. What we see in Eritrea today is a steady deterioration of the human condition, not an amelioration of the human condition. And this very fact alone delegitimizes his government. And this is my central argument. Otherwise, my footnote regarding that issue is to underscore that this is really not an issue, and he has made it an issue because of his own behavior, etc., etc.
Mr. Ambassador,
it should be understood. That's the sense in which it should be understood. I'm not saying it's an issue. I'm not saying people should take it as an issue. I'm saying that he has managed to make an issue out of a non-issue. For me, it's still a non-issue. It's always a non-issue. It will remain as a non-issue. But the fact I just pointed out, the fact that he made an issue out of a non-issue.
Mr. Ambassador, do you also hold the president responsible for igniting the Eritrean-Ethiopian war?
No, I do not. I'm very clear in that, okay? In the sections that deal with the war, I speak of several missed opportunities to amicably, peacefully address all the outstanding issues pertaining to the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. I also describe in great detail not only the missed opportunities, but the steps that led to the ignition of the war. I also maintain that the border issue was a trigger, not the cause of the war. If you read my book carefully, you will see that the president alone is not responsible. It takes two to tango. And in fact, my understanding is that he was provoked into that. And of course, you can read the book. It's a story that will require another hour to describe. But I am not one of those who accuse him of direct responsibility for the war. No. But I believe the war was preventable. The war was avoidable. The war was unnecessary. And we could have addressed the issue to the better interest of Eritrea peacefully. And there were possibilities that were passed over, or opportunities that were missed, I should say. So categorically, I don't hold the president of Eritrea alone responsible for the ignition of the war. There are factors which I describe. So let me just say, paraphrase what I tried to say.
Absolutely, absolutely.
He alone is not responsible. But he could have proactively prevented the outbreak of the war, not alone, but with his Ethiopian counterpart.
Mr. Ambassador, but you are very, very critical of his management of the war, right?
Yes, and it comes out very clearly in my book, yes.
Can you elaborate on that so that people who haven't read the book?
In the first place, I want to state this for the record. The war was unnecessary. It was avoidable, okay? And should not have been fought. But once joined in, you don't go to war in order to lose, okay? So what I'm saying is the mismanagement that emanated from him sort of handicapped the Eritrean army. Look, I'll be more specific. One, military intelligence is a key component of warfare. In fact, many military theorists believe that pre-knowledge, that is accurate, actionable intelligence, accounts for over 70% of the outcome of a battle. The transitional president dismantled the hitherto superb military intelligence apparatus of the EPLF that was quite decisive in determining the victorious outcome of the War of National Liberation. So one handicap of the Eritrean defense forces during this unnecessary war, they had no reliable, actionable intelligence at their disposal in waging this war. One. And that I specifically blame the transitional president for having dismantled the superb military intelligence apparatus that enabled us, to a large extent, win the war without a replacement. Second, the chief of staff was suspended. The Eritrean Defense Forces fought this war without a chief of staff. If you know what a chief of staff is, the functions are, is administrative, it's logistics, it's supplies, it's equipment, etc., etc., etc. So at critical moments in the war, at critical moments when intense battles were raging, the Eritrean Defense Forces were handicapped by the lack of adequate supplies, adequate armaments, adequate ammunition, adequate munitions, supply of munitions, etc., because they had no chief of staff to supervise the supply of provisions properly. Third, the principal military strategists, tacticians, experts, without whose expertise, whose contribution the War of National Liberation could not have been won, were suspended during this war. In other words, there was no effective, capable command and control mechanism guiding the operations of the Eritrean Defense Forces during that war, because those experts were marginalized and suspended and therefore not able to make their input into the war effort. So what I'm saying is the war was fought without proper intelligence, without proper provisions, and without proper command and control mechanism. And these three deficiencies undermined the combat effectiveness of the Eritrean Defense Forces and dictated the outcome, which saw large tracts of Eritrean territory under Ethiopian occupation in the southwestern and central sectors in particular. So when I speak of the mismanagement of the war, I'm speaking of these concrete factors which I elaborate in my book, by the way.
Some say that we should be solely focused on removing the regime and not dwell on past wrongs. Others say that we should be asking all kinds of questions because trusting is what got us into this mess in the first place. Now, what do you think? Should we have these kind of conversations to hold former government officials like you accountable for their actions and to explain their decisions? Or we should say, as long as you join the opposition camp to dismantle the regime, that is, it's okay. Let's not even talk about it. What's your take on that?
Look, there is time for everything, as they say. I think we should have a healthy conversation about our past so that we glean lessons from them and will not be condemned to repeat them when the time comes, okay? But we should conduct this conversation in a way as to not to obstruct our struggle for democratic change in Eritrea. In other words, the past is there for us to draw lessons from, to avoid mistakes, to strengthen the advantages that we possess as a people, as a movement, etc., etc. At the same time, we should focus on the need to remove this change and to ensure a democratic transition. What we face in Eritrea today is a real danger. You have, in the first place, in Eritrea, you know as much as I do, that there is no freedom of speech, freedom of expression, there is no freedom of association, there is no freedom of assembly, and therefore there is no opportunity to debate the present situation and the future of Eritrea and to come up with a way to save the country from implosion. There is, of course, very little organization. The only organized body in the country is the Eritrean Defense Forces. The government is dysfunctional. The ministries are dysfunctional. There is really nothing that functions well in the country today. So in Eritrea today, there is a real risk of implosion. And we Eritreans have a great responsibility to ensure that the removal of this regime would not result in the disintegration of the state. We have to make a distinction between the government, the regime, and the state of Eritrea, of course, the state and the people of Eritrea. So I think we have a responsibility. So I'm saying we can have a healthy conversation, a healthy debate of the past, but we should not be living in the past as to forget our future and to forget our present and compromise our future. I will give you one thing today. People are talking all kinds of things today. You know, there is a saying in Tigrinya which says, you know, people who are talking today, people who are disseminating all kinds of untruths, all kinds of malignant talk, all kinds of things that delegitimize the armed struggle, are people who contributed nothing towards the armed struggle or during the armed struggle, okay? They have a right to talk. Okay, I'm not going to constrain that. But they have an obligation of due diligence. Even many so-called leading intellectuals fail to engage in due diligence to ascertain the veracity of whatever it is that they accuse somebody in the government, out of the government, of something. And without due diligence, they continue to disseminate. And unfortunately, people, when they hear it so many times, this Hitlerite logic of if you repeat a lie so many times, then it becomes a truth, etc., etc. I do not believe in that. So to paraphrase, what I just said. I think we should engage in healthy conversation about the past. We should discuss the failings, the successes. A balanced debate is very important, but we should also focus on the present, on the need to change, on the need to save our country from implosion, on the need to ensure a democratic transition, on the need to establish a government that provides equal opportunity, equal access to amenities, and treats everybody equally as an Eritrean. Eritrea belongs to all Eritreans, and all Eritreans have a responsibility to resist the current dictatorship and to fight for change. But this change must be democratic change. We must debate what needs to be done during the transition. We must debate what needs to be done to save the country from implosion and to save the people from further suffering. Because Eritrea, the people of Eritrea today are worse off as a people than at any time in their modern history.
You know, Mr. Ambassador, you have to forgive me. One of the best features of your book is actually that you seem to be very appreciative of the role of the diaspora in helping bring about a democratic Eritrea. However, you just made a statement that somehow I'd like you to explain how it comports with your vision of including the diaspora population to participate in the democratic process. You said that folks who did not contribute anything to the armed struggle are making all kinds of comments and innuendos. And I have to admit, I have also heard this remark before where you allegedly made a statement saying that folks who did not lift a spoon to help Eritrea are asking us to apologize. First of all, did you even make that remark? But more importantly, why do you believe that folks who did not participate in the armed struggle should not have a right to criticize you or anyone for that matter?
No, let me clarify. I did say that. I confirm to you. But the way I said it, that people who did not lift even a spoon have no right to malign people who fought falsely. This is the key. They have no right to make accusations based on anyone. What I'm saying is they must do due diligence. I think you can engage in constructive criticism. Everybody's entitled into that. Okay. But what I'm against is these people who, I don't know what motivates them, who is behind them, etc., are raising issues, questioning the very legitimacy of the armed struggle, which is really a central element of modern Eritrean history. The legitimacy of the very principle of Eritrean sovereign independence. Okay. The sacrifices for which our martyrs gave their lives. So I'm saying there is a difference between constructive criticism that's factually based and criminalizing somebody from thin air without doing your due diligence and maligning these people and the heroes of the armed struggle. So I don't know if I'm articulating it clearly. I'm not against criticism. I'm not against criticism, but I'm against people who have contributed nothing and are maligning the legitimacy of the armed struggle, the heroism of the freedom fighters of the Eritrean people, the martyrs of the Eritrean armed struggle, etc., because these are the values on which a future democratic Eritrea should be founded.
But don't you think,
should be cherished?
Well, I'm sorry, I do not mean to interrupt you. Please proceed, sir.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you as a leader, I would think that you would be fully appreciative and you would think as heroes, the housemaids and the taxi drivers and the security guards and all the manual workers who really duke it out and help out in a very, very challenging Western economy
to support their country day and night. And so you too are heroes, and you have every right to ask any question. Do you think that undermines the posture?
No.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Look, actually, when you interrupt me, I was going to go into this answer, into this question.
Please,
The
sir.
role of the diaspora, I think I have a whole chapter dedicated to the diaspora. The diaspora played a very commendable, a very crucial, in fact, role during the war. At different stages, it's very difficult to imagine that the EPLF would have emerged at the EPLF the way it did without the significant input from the diaspora in the Middle East, in Europe, in North America. I was myself in the diaspora. I was myself in North America as chairman of Eritreans for Liberation in North America. I was myself deeply engaged in the student movement that was splintered in Europe, in North America, in the Middle East, between supporters of the EPLF at the time, Eritrean People's Liberation Forces, and the ALF, etc., etc. No matter what, the diaspora as a whole played a crucial role, not only in terms of raising significant financial resources from its very meager means, the way you described it, but also in sending volunteers who became leading figures in both fronts, by the way. And the diaspora continued. And in fact, I will tell you that after independence, many in the diaspora had relocated to Eritrea to be part of the process of the reconstruction and rebuilding, development of the country. So the diaspora has made immense contribution, and I believe it can make even greater contribution today. It has also tried between 1991 and 1998. There were many who came as to set up businesses with seed money, with expertise, with entrepreneurship, people who came to advise, people who came as civil servants. No, don't misunderstand me. The diaspora played a significant role as a source of political, diplomatic support, as a source of material support, as a source of human recruitment, fighters, etc., etc. And I believe the diaspora has a very important role to play also in the future. Compare the diaspora population and the population at home. The diaspora, wherever it lives, segments of the diaspora, they have opportunities for access to higher education. They have opportunities for gainful employment. In Eritrea, there is no gainful employment, by the way. And there is no access to proper higher education worth its name in Eritrea, by the way. So when you look at the diaspora, you have much more, a relatively larger educated people who are more blessed with financial resources than their counterparts at home, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is the diaspora can play a very important role in the democratic transition of Eritrea and in the reconstruction and development of a future democratic Eritrea, as it has done so during the armed struggle and after the declaration of independence, after the actually military victory, after the armed struggle. So don't mistake me when I say this. And these people in the diaspora who contributed during the war are also heroes, as much as those who put their lives on the line in the field. I'm not maligning these people. I am referring to the people who had no role as members of the diaspora or at home during the war, even during the construction, who are now defending this regime or being instrumentalized by this or another to malign the liberation movement itself, the very legitimacy of the struggle itself, and the heroism of those who fell in the war, and of course the contribution of many who are no longer in the service of the dictatorship, etc., etc. So my criticism is not directed at those who played a role, or those who contributed to Eritrea to become free, to become independent, I should say, because Eritrea is not really free in the real sense of the term. So
Can I ask you a
I
question?
hope I have made my point clear. These are not the object of my criticism. The people I criticize, the people, look, when I say who've not lifted a spoon, what does it mean? A taxi driver who contributed part of his earnings, he did not only lift a spoon, he made a significant contribution of his earnings to the movement, okay? An Eritrean lady who worked as a housemaid, as a nurse, as a teacher, as a researcher, etc., who contributed part of her salary. This is what made the victory possible. In a sense, the whole population of Eritrea at home, virtually I should say, because there were elements who didn't, but virtually the entire population of Eritrea at home and abroad participated in and contributed to the victory of the armed struggle. And all these people are not the object of any criticism from me or from anybody. Whatever they say, I accept gracefully. It is those who've done nothing of the sort who now open their mouths and do not have even the decency to engage in due diligence and just repeat innuendos, malign people, criminalize people, etc., etc. So I think these are the kind of people I'm talking about. Otherwise, Eritreans at home in the diaspora who contributed, look, even those who did not contribute have a right to criticize, have a right to express their opinions. But freedom comes with responsibility. If I am going to accuse you, I must have the facts to support my accusation. Okay? This is the point I'm trying to make.
Which brings me about temperament and the ability to hear other people's point of view and be constructive and reflective, and someone who is an active listener, who is nurturing of the public, who believes in freedom of speech. And so would you say that you're a different leader than the leader you are trying to replace?
In the first place, I've never taken myself as a leader. I was a freedom fighter. I resist the regime now. But in the resistance, I like people to listen to each other. I like people to engage in a meaningful conversation. I like people to exchange freely, openly, in a constructive way. I think malignant accusations, criminalization without facts does more harm than good to the resistance. And these people do not have the interest of the resistance at heart. These people are doing that for whatever reasons they know themselves. And so many things pass in the name of the resistance. Okay, and I know about how regimes like the dictatorship and others like them operate. And therefore, I am saying that, look, if you want to criticize, you're entitled to your criticism, but please do your due diligence, come with the evidence, be able to corroborate what you say. Otherwise, don't engage in these malignant accusations that are baseless in fact.
Let's just proceed forward so that we could actually bring an end to what has been a great conversation. And I have a tremendous respect for the fact that you've availed yourself to talk with us. Mr. Ambassador, from the EPLF to the PFDJ and now to apparently Medrach. Why Medrach and why now? And why not join any of the current opposition movements and help from within?
There is really no dearth of organizations in the diaspora opposition, but there is resistance inside, of which we are aware. So what we felt was missing was this concept of Eritrean ownership of the change agenda and the primacy of the internal forces of resistance. And what we decided to do is build or avail a platform for a national conversation, a platform for dialogue to nurture appreciation for the need for Eritrean ownership of the change process, of the change agenda, for recognition of the primacy of the internal forces of resistance, for the need to support and enforce the internal forces of resistance, and on the need to bring a broad coalition of the open opposition in the diaspora on the basis of these parameters. So we're not just, another organization. Basically, yes, Mesfun is a political movement with political objectives, but it is a platform for dialogue, endeavoring or trying to create the coalescence of opposition forces along or on the basis of a unity of purpose, which would lead to a unity of action. And we're engaged in this continuous conversation through workshops, seminars, conferences, some of which we've held in the past, and some of which are in the pipeline for the future. What we're trying to build is a common understanding, not only on the imperative for change, a unity of action, not based just on hatred of the current regime, but on common objectives. And what are these common objectives? A future democratic Eritrea that's based on the rule of law, that respects human rights, democratic principles, and rule of law, etc. So every effort to bring about the organizational unity of the opposition forces has resulted in further splintering. Because what's missing is, or what has been missing is ownership, Eritrean ownership of the change agenda, recognition of the internal forces of resistance, of the primacy of the internal forces of resistance, and therefore of the need to support, reinforce, strengthen these internal sources, and also to build a political bridge between a more united diaspora opposition and the internal forces of resistance to crystallize change from within. So this would be the contribution of Mesfun. Maybe I can explain this in greater detail on another occasion.
Well, I think that, again, I want to say I appreciate this conversation, and I would actually like to give you an opportunity to state anything you would like to say that you have not been able to say, or a question we might not have asked.
I think today Eritrea is in a very difficult state of being. Things have been going economically, politically, socially, culturally. There has been a steady deterioration. Every year things have gone from bad to worse. And I don't know how much worse things can become. The country is being emptied of its youth. The economy is in a shambles. The family has been targeted. The destruction of the family, all this indefinite national service, so-called, modern day servitude, if you will, targets the family. People are no longer able to build normal lives, to build families. Even the very continuity of Eritrea as a society, because the family is the basis of the community, and the community is the basis of society, society is the basis of the nation. These are the targets. So what I'm saying is, time is of the essence. We must reverse this downsliding of Eritrea in every aspect, in all its dimensions. And we must hurry the establishment of a democratic government. In other words, we must work towards removing the dictatorship and building a transitional process that would land us in a democratic state. And this should be our primary concern. Eritrea belongs to all Eritreans, and it's Eritreans fighting together, resisting together, that can bring about a new Eritrea that's democratic, that's just, that's free, and that's also prosperous.
And on that note, Mr. Ambassador, we want to thank you for all the time you took to talk with us. Best of luck to you. And again, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest was His Excellency Ambassador Andebrhan Giorgis. Mr. Andeberhan is an adjunct professor at Vesalius College and research fellow at the Free University of Brussels. Recently, Mr. Andeberhan wrote a book, Eritrea at a Crossroads, a narrative of triumph, betrayal, and hope. Until we meet again, goodbye.